Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. And now, folks, it's time to look into Lighten Up. One day when I was traveling through Kentucky, I noticed the fields of tobacco, and I mentioned it to one of the friends that I stopped by. He told me about how difficult it actually is to grow tobacco, even though, of course, it was a weed for years. There was a time when we just planted tobacco in the ground. However, along came a little bug. The flea beetle has such an appetite for tobacco that today we germinate tobacco indoors in what they call hotbeds and cold frames, very controlled environments. Before it is planted into the field, the land has to be completely sterilized with very extreme chemicals. In the United States, we have a tobacco that tastes a little different than the rest of the world. And the way they achieve that is, once it is planted in the fields, it is fertilized with a substance called apatite. Kind of pretty stuff, isn't it? It's a phosphorus, and it, with a name like apatite, certainly sounds like a desirable thing. What apatite does is it starves the plants of nitrogen, and that gives American tobacco its unique flavor. Besides phosphates, apatite has some other ingredients as well. Namely, it has radium, lead-210, and polonium-210, which happen to be radioactive carcinogens. For centuries and centuries before the West discovered it, tobacco was used in many societies as a religious symbol and as a way of securing deals and becoming peaceful with one another. The plant grows naturally in North and South America, Australia, Southwest Africa, and the South Pacific. One name that became associated with tobacco was that of French ambassador and scholar Jean Nicot. Jean also produced one of the first French dictionaries. Jean was an ambassador to Portugal from 1559 to 1561. He had been sent there by Queen Consort Catherine de' Medici of France in order to secure the marriage of these two young people. At the time, Margot was a French princess. She was 6. And Alonso was a Portuguese king. He was 5. In 1559, while he was still in Portugal, Jean came across some snuff, and he sent a sample back to the Queen Consort of France. Catherine took right to that stuff. She liked it a lot. She'd be seen sniffing on her snuff all day long, and it wasn't long before all of the proper pavilions and the proper courts of France had everyone doing snuff. Because Jean Nicot had sent the samples, what they were sniffing became known as nicotine. And from that, we now have the substance in tobacco that we call nicotine. Nicotine is found in many, many plants in small quantities. It is a neurotoxin that is harmful to insects and therefore protects the plants. Tobacco comes from the nightshade family, and it has a higher level of nicotine than most plants. There are many, many species of tobacco. They are all from the genus Nicotiana, another name that we owe to Jean Nicot. Initially, tobacco was enjoyed primarily as snuff and rolled into its own leaves as cigars. Now, I'm just going to jump right in here and have my say. I have always thought that when you see somebody sitting there puffing on a big old cigar, it looks just like somebody's sitting there sucking on a big old turd. Now, I'll agree, there's one difference between somebody puffing on a cigar and sucking on a turd, and that is the turd smells better. Hey, get out of here. This is my story. As we were saying before we were so rudely interrupted, after snuff and rolling tobacco in its own leaves, it became popular to wrap it in tissue paper. It got to where they had people whose job it was to sit and hand wrap tobacco in tissue paper to make professionally made cigarettes, or small cigars, a handy way to deliver nicotine. Hand-rolling cigarettes could be done at about 4 per minute by someone who is experienced. Needless to say, ready-made cigarettes were a pricey object. In 1870, Allen and Gintner Company of Richmond, Virginia, offered a $75,000 prize for someone who would invent a machine that could roll cigarettes. A young man named James Albert Bosnack took them up. He dropped out of school and proceeded to work on his machine from 1870 until 1880. By 1880, he had these plans drawn up and a sample of the machine made. He was ready to go to the patent office when the store that he had his machine stored in burnt to the ground. He quickly made another. He applied for the patent on September 4th, 1880, and he was given the patent in 1881. Bosnack's machine could produce 12,000 cigarettes an hour. From that machine has grown the modern tobacco industry. Today, lobbyists for the tobacco industry spend over $106,000 every day that legislatures are in session. Of course, their job is to keep tobacco from being regulated. And, of course, ever since the beginning of the modern tobacco industry, the industry has been working to improve its products. Somewhere along the line, they added saltpeter to the paper so that the cigarette would continue to burn when it was not being smoked. In April 1994, Congress asked the industry to tell them what all they add to tobacco. The different companies brought a list of 599 different additives that they put into cigarettes to make them taste better, to make them burn better, to make the smoking enjoyment better, and, of course, to make it more addictive. I have been reading that since 1994, the tobacco industry is adding much more nicotine to the cigarettes, again, for the purpose of addiction. All of these additives are approved for consumption in the American diet. However, that approval assumes that they will be consumed orally without being burnt. When these additives, as well as the nicotines and tars that are already in tobacco, are burnt, we get over 2,000 different chemical compounds in the smoke. And now, to get to what got me started on all of this. I was reading in the AARP magazine about the different states and the percentage of people that are still smoking. Cigarette consumption has been going down in the United States, and indeed most of the developed world. So, the cigarette companies are now pushing their product more actively in the third world. In fact, by 2001, the nation's of the world had gotten together and come up with a plan that would keep tobacco consumption going down worldwide. One of the first acts of the Bush administration was to pull the United States out of that agreement, and with it, our financial support. Even with this drop in the number of people smoking in the United States, the largest consumption of cigarettes by any one state per capita is, not surprisingly, Kentucky, which of course produces a lot of tobacco. In Kentucky, 28.6% of the population still smokes. Indeed, all of the top 10 states that have the highest per capita consumption of cigarettes are solidly in the Bible Belt. The exception to that is Alaska, which is the 5th largest consumer of cigarettes per capita. I do find it amusing that those who go to the trouble of being so far from civilization are so dependent on a product that takes all of civilization to get it to them. What initially got me interested in this was at the very bottom of the list is Utah, with 9.8% of its population smoking cigarettes. Utah being at the bottom of the list really didn't surprise me at all. However, when I noticed that Idaho was number 3 on the list, and at number 3 had 16.8% of its population smoking cigarettes, I got curious as to, well, who would be number 2? Who would be smoking fewer cigarettes per capita than Idaho? It turns out that the one state that smokes fewer cigarettes than Idaho, except Utah, is, yes, California. Who would think? California at 14.9%. Interestingly, the number 4 state that smokes a little bit more than Idaho is Connecticut at 17. Connecticut, Idaho, California, and then Utah. The red states and the blue states certainly get along when it comes to being at the bottom of the smoking list. Let's get into old MacDonald's overalls and play E-I-E-I-O. It's East Idaho. East Idaho. Wow. It's not a very long drive, folks, and there are some mighty interesting things to check out over on the great eastern side of Idaho. In past episodes of E-I-E-I-O, we've gone and looked at the beautiful Henry Fork country, and then we headed down south of Pocatello, checking out beautiful southeast Idaho. We got off of the freeway on Highway 91 and went and explored the amazing thing that happened at Red Rock Pass. We drove County Road D1 down to Dayton and then drove to the east a little bit to check out Preston. We dipped down across the Bear River and then found ourselves climbing a bit of a hill up to Preston. Preston is a charming little farming community and had a great little 1950s themed cafe that had a great Reuben sandwich. Today we're going to drive Highway 36 back through the farm country to Dayton, then down to Weston, and then up past Deep Creek Reservoir. Eventually we'll end up in Malad City. So, leaving beautiful Preston, we drive down that little bit of a hill and back across the Bear River. Between Dayton and Weston, we see the Bear River Valley and Preston off to the east. From Dayton down to Weston is as lovely a drive as we've gotten used to over here in eastern Idaho. Heading west from Weston, we begin to see the rolling agricultural hills become steeper and steeper as they give way to mountains. Heading toward this canyon in the mountains, we know we're in for a delightful, curvy little drive. As we approached the Bannock Range of mountains, the little road we were on was so delightful I decided to get out the car cam and take a little view of the movement. It was the 1st of October. What a great time to be driving around Idaho. As we came around a corner, I noticed a flat piece of earth and figured we must have found the Deep Creek Dam. When I saw a spillway structure on it, I was pretty sure that we'd made it. I've tried finding statistics on just how high and wide this dam is, but haven't been able to find anything for you. It's a fairly good-sized structure, though. And the dam features the only roadside rest all the way between Malad City and Preston. For a sense of scale, this is the spillway entrance for Arrow Rock Dam on the Boise River. The spillway entrance on the Deep Creek Dam is exactly the same sort of side entrance structure, just a little different scale. The reservoir behind Deep Creek Dam is truly a lovely spot, and I can see why it is popular with recreationists. To accommodate all these recreationists reaching the dam and, indeed, the roadside rest stop, we have a typical, fine Idaho tourist structure. From the Deep Creek Dam, we continue our journey on Highway 36, heading through the Bannock Range of mountains. Eventually, we come to Freeway 15 and head down to beautiful Malad City. Well, John was a nice guy, and he got married for the usual reason. He just fell head over heels in love. Unfortunately, it wasn't too long before his darling wife turned into a horrible nag. She nagged and she nagged and she nagged, and this went on for years and years and years. Well, they'd been together a long time and the kids were out of the house. And finally, they decided, let's treat ourselves to something special. And they decided to go on a trip to the Holy Land. They weren't there terribly long, and unfortunately, the food's not what we're used to. And pretty soon, his wife got sick, and it was real quick. She just up and died. Of course, there was the shock of it, but there was also the reality that it wasn't going to be long and he was going to be going home, so he had to make some arrangements. He went and talked with an official potentate about how to handle this. The official assured him, well, you can ship her home for about $6,000, or you can bury her here in the magical Holy Land. Imagine how wonderful that would be to be buried in the Holy Land. And besides, that would only cost about $500. Well, John thought and thought, and after just a few minutes, he says, I guess we better ship her home. Well, the potentate was amazed at that and says, why? Why would you want to spend all that money sending her back home when she can be buried in the Holy Land? John said, well, I heard a story that somebody once died here and they buried him, and 3 days later he came back to life. And I just can't take that chance. And that's this week's Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo.